感谢各位参加中央研究院特别讲座。现在我们请中央研究院李远哲院士为我们主持这场演讲。Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Academia Sinica special lecture. It is our great pleasure to have the academician of Academia Sinica, Professor Li Yuanzhe, moderate today's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Li.
Professor Sunstein, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Sunstein, who is going to give the Academia Sinica's special lecture this morning. Professor Sunstein is the Robert Wormsley University Professor of Harvard University. He's a legal scholar, particularly in the fields of constitutional law, administrative law, environmental law, behavioral law, and economics. He's been regarded as one of the most influential and adventurous legal scholars for a generation. I will not go through his illustrious career in great detail, but I cannot help but mentioning what was a seminal sources of inspiration in his life and career. I'll read what he said. I became a political science major only because of those Star Wars movies. You saw those movies and you had to focus on political science, said Sunstein, adding that his love of behavioral science grew out of his fascination with the field's stormtroopers. He said, the Supreme Court Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall, that's a great one, for whom he clerked after law school, was his substitute for the film's all-knowing mentor, Ben Obi-Wan Kenobi. After working for after working for Thurgood Marshall. He worked in the Justice Department as an attorney advisor for a year. And then he took a job as an assistant professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School in 1981. I think it is a very good choice, since I also started my academic career at the University of Chicago as an assistant professor. That was 47 years ago. In 1985, he was made a full professor of both political science and law. In 1988, he was named the Carl and Reverend Professor of Jurisprudence in the Law School and Department of Political Sciences. The university honored him in 1993 with its Distinguished Service accolade, permanently changing his title to Carl and Reverend Distinguished Service Professor of Jurisprudence in the Law School and Department of Political Science. In the fall of 2008, after 27 years in the University of Chicago, he joined the faculty of Harvard Law School. From 2009 to 2012, he headed White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, working for the President Barack Obama. In today's lecture, Professor Sunstein was supposed to describe the latest development in the field of behavioral law and economics, especially in the notion of nudging people to choose for their better life. As the COP21 in Paris is coming to a close, we'll be extremely interested in hearing your lecture. Let us give a big hand to welcome Professor Sunstein to give the special lecture for Academia Sinica.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm giving, I think, 5 talks during my visit, and this might be my favorite, so I hope you don't hate it. Okay, there have been significant developments in the very recent past. The United States has created a social and behavioral sciences team. It is in the White House. It's been up and running for about 2 years. In Germany and Australia, recently, similar teams have been created. Australia's Prime Minister announced just about 3 weeks ago that it has created a behavioral economics team to try to use the kind of work that I'll be describing to make people's lives better. The United Kingdom has had such a group since 2010. It's often described as the nudge unit, and its effort is to use behavioral insights to try to make the environment better, to try to make health better, to try to make government more efficient. And there is activity in many nations, including Canada, Mexico, Colombia, Italy, and France. I am hopeful that Taiwan might be the first Asian government to be using behavioral insights to try to help people live better lives. In 2015, the World Bank announced its annual report. That's this year. And this is a remarkable development where the World Bank devoted its entire report to the use of behavioral insights, urging that if we're interested in increasing economic productivity, reducing disease, helping children to be educated, and promoting energy conservation, there is a chance to make great progress through the use of behavioral insights. Things are moving very rapidly. Within the last weeks, the World Bank announced that it is following this report with a global insights unit, which has now been created, which is trying to use behavioral science to try to help economic development. There are a few higher priorities. There are places all over the world where people are struggling to get educated, where nations are struggling to collect taxes, where people are dying young, where deprivation is pervasive, and the World Bank is expecting that the use of behavioral insights will be helpful. We have a development in the United States, which is truly historic, just from a few months ago, where our President Obama, issued an executive order. An executive order is like law. It binds the rest of our government. So it's an effort by the president to direct the rest of his government to do something. And you can see here, the instruction is that the rest of the federal government should be designing policies reflecting behavioral insights involving how people actually make decisions. In this executive order, the president said that there should be improvement in how information is presented to consumers by considering how the content, format, timing, and medium affects comprehension and action. Now, I don't read your language, but my expectation is that some documents you've received from your government aren't as simple and comprehensible as they might be. Is that true? Almost every nation has that experience. You might have had communications from companies of various sorts which could benefit from improving the content, timing, and medium of communication. And that's what the president has directed our government to do. I think this is extremely important. The president said that programs that offer choices should be reassessed to consider how the structure and presentation of those choices can be improved to more effectively promote public welfare, giving particular consideration to the selection and setting of default options. Now, I didn't find you standing and cheering when you heard the words giving particular consideration to the selection and setting of default options. But I believe, and I'm going to try to convince you, that there should be a worldwide explosion of applause at any effort to give particular consideration to the selection and setting of default options. There was a reference just a moment ago to the discussions in Paris, the very important discussions in Paris. If we want to do something about greenhouse gas emissions, I'm going to try to show, selecting better default options could help enormously in that task. For policies with a regulatory component, and think now about environmental protection or highway safety or obesity policy or infectious disease policy or food safety, the President directed reviewing existing regulations with an emphasis on behavioral and science insights. Okay, what I've said thus far, you've seen many nations, diverse nations, the World Bank, and the President of the United States, all in 2015. Everything I've described is this year, using behavioral insights to try to reform policies, which raises an evident question: how did we get here? We're in the midst, in terms of policy making and law, of a behavioral revolution. That is a very large-scale thinking about rethinking of government policy. How did we get here? And the answer is social science. This is an area where social science very recently has had an extraordinary impact. Now, I taught at the University of Chicago for many years. I love it dearly. I believe that there is no university, at least in the United States, that is better. And you are looking right now at the theme song of the University of Chicago. This could be set to music. It is almost a haiku, isn't it? Almost a haiku. Human beings are rational. They calculate probabilities and maximize expected value, and they respond to incentives. There's a great poem by the English poet John Keats that says, truth is beauty, Booth Trudy, that is all ye need to know on earth. All ye need to know. This is like that. That's all ye need to know on earth. And the policy prescription is to improve incentives. If you want to make law work better for people, contract law, tort law, property law, constitutional law, improve incentives. That's the prescription. And people respond to incentives because they are rational and they calculate probabilities and maximize expected value. Now, I will say that when I heard this poem at the University of Chicago as a young man, I thought that the people who are reciting this poem, some of them are divorced. Some of them are sad that their investments have not worked out well. And some of them, when they play tennis, hit absurdly ambitious forehands, which end up going out of the court. They are not necessarily calculating probabilities and maximizing expected value. What I lacked was an account of where they might be wrong. Okay, here are, I think I'll stand to give so I can see you in the back a little bit better. Here are some behavioral objections starting in the 1970s. Human beings often show present bias. What that means is human beings have a tendency to focus on today and tomorrow and next month, and not on 3 years from now, and certainly not on 20 years from now. Some of you in the room look very young. Are you thinking when you make your decisions, what is life going to be like 30 years from now? I'm looking at you right there. You probably don't. Most people don't. In fact, there's a part of the brain that lights up when people think about themselves. So shall we have a little experiment right now? Think about yourself on a beach in a week. Picture yourself on a beach in a week. Most of you did it, 3 of you didn't. All of you, think of yourself on a beach in a week. Okay, as you did that, a certain part of the brain lit up. It's identifiable. When people think about themselves, we can think about this as the narcissistic part of the brain. It lights up. Now, if you would, think of yourself on the same beach in 2017. Please, do it. Imagine yourself in 2017 on the same beach. For a certain number of you, that part of the brain lit up. For a certain number of you, it didn't. Now, what's interesting about this is for those of you for whom that part of the brain did not light up, you would rather have a little money tomorrow than a lot of money in a month. You show present bias, very strong present bias. Even for those of you for whom that part of the brain did light up, when you think about yourself in a year on a beach, there's a tendency to show present bias. It's built into the human species. And there's an evolutionary reason. In hunter-gatherer societies, if people who are at the edge of subsistence and maybe running from a lion are thinking, what is life going to be like in 20 years? The lion will eat them. They have to think about now. Okay. People are also loss averse, meaning they like losses. They dislike losses more than they like corresponding gains. People very much dislike losses from the status quo. Now, we're going to have a little experiment to demonstrate loss aversion right now. My hosts have given me the authority to give this half of the room the equivalent of 10 American dollars. Every one of you gets 10 American dollars. You're a little lucky. The rest of you, this half of the room, the hosts have given me the authority to say, each of you has to give me 10 American dollars. I'm really sorry. Okay, now, for those of you, that's not true. None of that is true. But for those of you who believed it, those of you who thought you had to give up 10 American dollars were much sadder than those of you who thought you were getting 10 American dollars were happy. A loss is very bad, even if an equivalent gain isn't so bad. That has policy consequences. If the government imposes a small tax on a good, it will have a much bigger impact than if a government says it's going to give people an equivalent subsidy in order to change their behavior. Behavior is more changed by a loss than by a gain. Okay, people often don't do well with probability. In the United States recently, people were very scared of Ebola, the disease Ebola, even though at the time more Americans had married most movie stars than had died of Ebola. So the risk of dying from Ebola was very low, but because the cases came readily to mind, people exaggerated the probability. So people's probability judgments are often mistaken, partly because they think, what is a recent event? And that can dominate their probability judgments. We know that people may be unrealistically optimistic. 90% of drivers in many countries have been found to believe they're safer than the average driver and less likely to be involved in a serious accident. If you ask two members of a couple, what percentage of the household work do you do? And add up the two percentages, if it isn't over 100%, it's a very unusual couple. In fact, there's only one demographic group that has been found not to suffer from unrealistic optimism. Only one group has an accurate sense of their possibilities and prospects and what other people think of them. Can you guess what the one realistic group is? The clinically depressed. Everybody else is unrealistically optimistic. Okay, I mentioned the Ebola case, and that is just an example of a very important heuristic or mental shortcut that people use in thinking about risk. And the heuristic is the availability heuristic, which suggests if you can think of an example of a case where a crime occurred in your life or the life of someone you care about, your probability judgment might be inflated. If you can't think of an example, your probability judgment is likely to be deflated. Here's a little video. I'm not going to show you the video, I'm going to tell you about the video. I'm going to tell you about the story about when I first saw the video. There was a room in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which had about 30 professors. We all were professors. And a colleague of ours at the front of the room showed us a little movie. It's about a 2-minute movie in which people dressed in white are passing basketballs to people dressed in black. And our job was to count the passes. How many passes? It wasn't easy because there were a lot of passes. I lost track about 50 seconds in to the movie, but kept trying. Everybody kept trying. At the end of the movie, the person who was conducting the experiment first asked us, how many passes did you count? And then asked, did you see the gorilla? All but one of the 30 of us thought this was a joke. No, we didn't see a gorilla. But one person raised his hand. I remember thinking that person is working with the experimenter because, of course, there was no gorilla. Then the experimenter said, look at the movie again. And there's the gorilla right there. We all missed the gorilla. I have a daughter who's 24 years old. I told her just what I told you, and then she said, can I see the video? I showed her the video. Afterwards, she said, where was the gorilla? Even knowing about the gorilla, she didn't see the gorilla. Now, the reason I think this is a very important experiment is that in social situations, our attention is inevitably selective. We don't see aspects of products and activities. If you purchase a refrigerator, there are probably features of the refrigerator that are like the invisible gorilla. You don't see them. If you're purchasing a car or a home or renting it, there may be aspects of the product that are invisible to you. They're like the gorilla. In fact, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 that the United States experienced is partly explained, I think, by the presence of invisible gorillas when people were buying real estate and they didn't understand aspects of the situation. Okay? Okay, I mentioned loss aversion, and I'm going to give you 2 examples and see if the two are connected. Is golf popular here? The sport golf? Yes, popular enough? Okay. Do you know what par is and birdie is? Are those explainable? Okay. So professional golfers, when they are putting for par, do better than when they are putting for birdie. If you take a professional golfer, and if that golfer putted as well for birdie as he or she putted for par, they'd make a lot more money. They do better putting for par than for birdie. That's surprising, isn't it? They should do the same. They're the same putt. If they know it's a birdie putt, they're more likely to miss it than if they know it's a par putt. That's the first thing I'm going to tell you. Here's the second thing I'm going to tell you. There are studies in various countries saying that the way to make teachers increase their students' performance is to increase the teacher's incentive by promising the teacher at the end of the year, if the math scores increase, the teacher gets more money. Surprisingly, that doesn't seem to work. The evidence isn't that the teachers teach better. As a long-time University of Chicago person, that puzzles me, but it's true. Here's another version of the same effort. If you give teachers money at the beginning of the year and tell them if their students' math scores don't get better at the end of the year, they're going to have to give the money back, then the math scores increase. Now I think the golfing story and the teacher story are exactly the same story. If you miss a par putt, you lose to par. Golfers want to be around par. A bogey is a loss. A birdie is a gain. People hate losses, and they focus hard on that putt. For the teachers, a gain is good. A bonus at the end of the year is good. But if you have to give money back at the end of the year, that's terrible. And that concentrates people's minds. Okay, here are behavioral policy claims emphasized basically in the last 15 years. I think I'm going to mention the one at the bottom first. If you want to change people's behavior, this is very old psychology from the 1930s. There are two things you can do. You can push them, or you can figure out why they aren't going there anyway and remove the source of resistance. This is relevant to marriage and friendship, as well as public policy. If you try to push people, that often doesn't work very well. If you remove the source of their resistance, that can be more effective. Thinking not, how can I give them an incentive to do this, is often less effective than thinking, what is it in their lives that's preventing them already from doing it? Okay, that's a behavioral policy claim. As in the story of the invisible gorilla, attention matters a lot. What are people focusing on? If a candy bar wrapper is green, people who care about health and the environment are more likely to buy it than if it's black or red, even if it's pure milk chocolate, because green suggests health and the environment. Green focuses attention on something that people who care about the health or environment see. It triggers their attention. Simplicity is very important. People can often use a nudge. It might save their lives, and I'll try to explain that in a moment. Choice architecture is exceedingly important, and it's not avoidable. The suggestion is, if you go to a website or go into a store or enter a classroom, there is a choice architecture in the situation, which will often affect outcomes. It's not avoidable. Items that are listed at the beginning of a list attract attention. In fact, there's a recent study. This is, I think, one of the funniest and best studies in the last decade. The National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the United States' main academic reporter of economic studies, every month they send out a list of the new economics papers. For someone like me, this is very exciting. You got a list of the new economics papers, and they're very good papers. It turns out that the economics articles that are first on the list are downloaded most. If you're in the middle or at the bottom, people are going to pay less attention to you. Now, the reason that I think is funny is we're talking about economists who believe in rationality, and yet their own behavior suggests that they are going to read the papers that are listed first. That's choice architecture. Default rules matter, where a default rule means the rule that specifies what happens if you do nothing. So your cell phone has some default settings on it, meaning they're the settings that will apply unless you change them. Your relationship with your employer often has default settings. Any legal system has default settings, saying this is the property law, this is the contract law. If you don't change it, this is how it's going to be. Default rules really matter. Now, the reason that's a noteworthy thing to say is one of the University of Chicago's greatest figures, one of my personal heroes, named Ronald Coase, has a theorem, which some of you probably are aware of, which says that the entitlement isn't going to matter so long as people can bargain. Okay, we'll have a little experiment on the Coase theorem here, shall we? It's going to be not a real experiment, but we can pretend. Okay, this half of the room, you all get a University of Chicago mug. It's a little mug, a University of Chicago mug. I'm sorry, this half of the room, you don't get a University of Chicago mug. But if you want to buy the mug from these people, you can. And you all, if you want to sell the mug to these people, you can. What do you think the median amount this group would be willing to pay to get your mug? And what do you think the median amount this group would demand to sell the mug? Okay, we could do that. We're not going to, but we could do that. I know what would happen. You all would have a median amount that you'd require to give up the mug that would be higher than you all would have as the median amount that you'd be willing to pay to get the mug. That is, your willingness to pay to get something you don't own will be lower than your demand to give up something that you own. And it occurs instantly. That's a product of the default rule. Now, it isn't because just by amazing miracle you all happen to like University of Chicago mugs less than you all do. It's because you all got the University of Chicago mugs. So the default rule matters. I'll give you another example if this one's a little obscure. Your computer is probably attached to a printer, or you can attach it to a printer. The default setting on the printer is either single-sided or double-sided. If the default setting is single-sided, people are going to use a lot more paper than if the default setting is double-sided, even if it's very easy to change it every time. Okay, so the default rule really matters. Okay, what is a nudge? That's a little elephant who is being nudged by the dad to get healthy, low-calorie elephant food. That elephant is being nudged. A GPS is a nudge. It's a perfect nudge. So a GPS allows you to go in the route that you want if you don't like the advice it's giving you, but it is telling you what the right route to go is to get in the direction you've specified. So the reason a GPS is such a perfect nudge is that it is helping people to go in the direction they want. It's not saying, we have a new direction for you. It's identifying a means, and you can reject it if you don't like it. This is a scandalous nudge. This is a urinal. Yes? Men, you've seen these. Women, that's a urinal. But it's not just any urinal. This is a urinal in the Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands. The Schiphol Airport had a problem of, forgive me, spillage. The men weren't as careful as cleanliness dictated, and their response was a nudge. They painted a fly. That's not a real fly. It's a painted fly. The result of the painted fly was to reduce spillage by 44%. Apparently, men can't help but aim at the fly. You can see this as the mirror image of the invisible gorilla, where people don't see the gorilla because they're focused on the basketballs. Here, they don't see basically where you're supposed to go unless you see a fly, and then the men aim at it. I don't know if you speak German. I don't, but I think this is easily understandable. This is a real postcard that someone sent me. It's a nudge that went wrong. It's a real postcard in Germany, apparently. Okay, to get to public policy, for savings plans, you could say there's going to be a Social Security program which will set the minimum, and most countries have Social Security programs, but you can also say that's probably not enough for most people, so we're going to set up an additional savings plan so that people can save more. The result of switching from a program where people can opt into the system to something where the default rule is they're in the system but they can opt out. You see the difference? Under one, people can opt in if they want it, and it's easy to opt in. Under the other, they can opt out if they don't want it, and it's easy to opt out. It's just a difference in the default rule. Automatic enrollment and savings plan with free opt-out dramatically increases participation for people at every end of the income distribution. This is a remarkable chart because it suggests that whether you are relatively wealthy or very poor, merely switching the default rule significantly increases levels of participation in savings programs. Now that's important for savings policy, and many countries are using automatic enrollment as a way of encouraging additional savings, but you can also think of an example of the potential use of default rules in many areas. So I hope you're thinking right now, where does a private or public institution that you know about have a default rule that would work much better if it were switched? Where is an opt-in system inferior to an opt-out system, but the organization you know about is currently working with an opt-in system? Okay. Okay, there was a reference to Paris. I mentioned single-sided and double-sided printing. I want to tell you about an experiment in Germany. About 20,000 households were sent a letter saying, if you want to have green energy, lower greenhouse gas emissions, environmentally better, please sign up. And it's very easy. In that condition, the level of sign up was very low, and the best predictor of whether people would sign up was whether they were in the Green Party. 20,000 other households were sent a letter saying, you are now automatically enrolled in clean energy. It's a little more expensive. If you want to opt out, you are free to do that. Under that version, there was a massive increase in use of green energy. And under that version, whether people were in the Green Party didn't predict at all whether they'd end up in green energy. Now, I think what's remarkable about this study is that it suggests a simple nudge, which is automatic enrollment in green energy, can, without reducing freedom, significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because once people are automatically enrolled, a very large number think, okay, that's fine, I'll stay. Whereas if people are asked whether they want to opt in, they think, it's going to cost a little bit more, no. I'll tell you a little story, a little personal story. I live in New York. In my apartment, I got a little letter, this is about 2 months ago, saying if you want to switch for your apartment to clean or green energy, please just fill out this postcard and mail it in. I like green energy. I care about it. Guess whether I filled out the postcard? No. Guess whether I lost the postcard? Yes. I have no idea where it is. This suggests that a default rule often fits people's preferences better, and a default rule just makes life easier, so it can be a better kind of nudge. Okay, so a nudge is a feature of the social environment that affects people's choices without imposing coercion or any kind of material incentive. So I'm hoping that you will observe in the next few days ways in which you are being nudged, maybe intentionally by someone, maybe just the design nudged you and no one meant to do it, but it did. A little example for you. If people sign forms at the end, they're less likely to be truthful than if they sign forms at the beginning. If you want to reduce fraud, at least current data suggests, ask people to sign at the beginning. Because once they sign at the beginning, they think, I'm on the line for this. I better make sure everything's true. If they sign at the end, at least some people think, yeah, whatever. Okay, disclosure of information is a nudge. A warning is a nudge. Drawing attention to social norms is a nudge. There's someone who knows about behavioral science, who's on Twitter. I've never met him, but he published a book recently, and he keeps saying on Twitter, I'm so grateful that so many people are buying my book. Sales are way above expectations. He's smart. I actually looked up his book. It's not selling very well. But it's probably selling better than it would have if he didn't have those tweets. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Cameron has been greatly concerned with tax delinquency. Some people aren't paying the taxes. They've used a strategy, the Behavioral Insights team in the United Kingdom, which is to send to delinquent taxpayers a very simple letter saying that, just adding one sentence to the normal form, saying, you are in a small minority of people in your neighborhood who aren't paying their taxes. That has had a very significant effect on tax delinquency. People don't like being in a small minority of people who aren't behaving properly. To draw attention to the social norm is often an extremely effective strategy for behavior change. A little nudge that is very effective is simply to give people a reminder. So for people who aren't completing their obligations on time, often it's because the date is like an invisible gorilla. It's not in their head. If you send them a reminder, it can be a very effective strategy. More effective than a standard incentive in the form of an economic payoff or economic loss if they don't do what they're supposed to do. I'm afraid you might forget reminders, so the slide has a little asterisk here, a reminder. Reminders. Don't forget reminders. Okay, framing is also effective. If people are told, suppose there's a medical procedure which you could have. People are told 90% of people who have the procedure are alive after 5 years. Most people say, I'll have that procedure. That's good. Suppose they're told 10% of people are dead after 5 years. I don't want that procedure. But they are identical statements. In fact, doctors have themselves been found vulnerable to framing effects. At least in English-speaking countries, doctors are more likely to recommend an operation if they're told 90% are alive after 5 years than if they're told 10% are dead after 5 years. If you look at obesity rates in some countries, they're going like this, steadily up. And if you look at portion sizes, they are going up at exactly the same rate. There is a clear association between how much people eat and the size of plates and portions. A good way to combat obesity is just to make the plates smaller or the portions smaller. That's a nudge. Okay, these things are not nudges. Jail, penalties and fines, subsidies and incentives. None of those is a nudge. They may be effective, they are not nudges. Okay, we have a problem in the United States, which is that poor children are eligible for free, nutritious breakfasts and lunch. A lot of poor children haven't signed up for this program. That's a problem. They are poor and maybe hungry, and they're not getting the food to which they're entitled. What should be done? I'll give you a few ideas. One is to send them their parents a note saying that you'll be penalized if you don't sign your kids up. Another is to send your parents a note saying, we'll give you a little money if you send in the form. Another possibility is to try moral suasion, saying your children deserve this. Please fill out the form. Another is education about the importance of signing up for the program. I don't know for sure, but I believe all of those approaches would fail. Here's an approach which I know succeeds. If public officials know that certain children are eligible, just make them directly certified for the meals. Don't make them sign up at all. The result of this initiative, which I had some participation in, is to increase by millions the number of children who are having school meals. It's like switching from single-sided to double-sided printing. Just switching the default rule. 12.4 million children are certified. Voting. Do you have to register to vote here? Great. It's automatic. That's a nudge. In the United States, of our 50 states, 48 of them require people to register. 2 of them, California and Oregon, have gone your direction and now say you are automatically a voter. That's great. It's worth thinking about other areas involving the environment and health, where something like automatic enrollment could be helpful. Okay, I have a slogan for you that's going to be obscure right now, and I hope it'll get clearer. Plate, not pyramid. That's the slogan. Plate, not pyramid. What you're looking at now was, for a period, I think, the most visited website in the United States government. It's called the Food Pyramid, and it was designed to help people to make healthy choices with respect to food. There's a person, you can't tell if it's a man or a woman, who has no shoes, who is walking to the top of a pyramid, a thin little slice of whiteness. What is that? Imagine you're a parent or a teacher or a student trying to understand what you're supposed to eat, looking at the pyramid. Do you know what you're supposed to eat? Well, there are these stripes. Do you know what the stripes refer to? I work on this stuff. I have absolutely no idea. Can you recognize the foods? And do you know what their association is with the stripes? This is not clear. Can you recognize any of the foods as foods? I recognize only one. On the bottom right, if you look carefully, that's clearly a shoe. Is the United States government saying people should eat their shoes? Is that the advice? What is that white triangle at the top anyway? Is that heaven? Is it death? Why is the person walking there? Okay, this is an ineffective nudge. In the US government, I found that some of our less successful programs were like the pyramid. People didn't understand them, and that was the source of the problem. Companies all over the world do less well than they should because they present people with the equivalent of a pyramid. People say, I don't understand that, forget it. Lawyers often, I fear, talk to people in pyramid talk, meaning it's not intelligible. Okay, we eliminated that and adopted this. It's called the food plate, and it says, make half your plate fruits and vegetables, and you're most of the way there. It suggests that often, if you want to change behavior through a good nudge, just give people simple advice that they can respond to. Lawyers often are most effective if they do exactly that, and legal systems sometimes fail because they present people with this. Okay, I'll tell you a story. The United States, about 4 years ago, was involved in a very important negotiation with another country. It was bilateral. It wasn't Russia or Syria, it wasn't the Middle East, it wasn't that level of drama, but it was important. And it was a negotiation that in the end the president would personally be present for, meaning the president was flying to that other nation, and the nation isn't close to the United States. So to ask the president to fly to another country, there should be some value for the country, for the United States, for the world. Something good should come out of the president's presence in that country. And a few days before the president was supposed to go there, we didn't have anything. We hadn't agreed on anything. That's not good. That's alarming. A friend of mine went to try to make progress on the negotiation under very difficult circumstances when it looked like we wouldn't have anything. And my friend was there, and I talked to the friend the next day after the first negotiation, and I asked, how did it go? And I heard in my cell phone over, the international lines, great, it went great. That was a big surprise. And I asked, why? How did that happen? And 3 words came into my ear: plate, not pyramid. I didn't understand it very well either. I said, what do you mean? And the explanation was given was the reason the United States and the other country hadn't agreed on anything was each was talking like the thing you're seeing now. I said, no. It was turned into plate. Here are 6 things the United States would like. Do you agree with any of them? And the country said, 4 are good. We like them too. Let's do those 4. Which suggests that often resistance to a suggestion is a product not of disagreement, but of ambiguity. And once things are clarified, you can make progress. Okay, here's what's called a smart cafeteria. It's a cafeteria where the healthy foods are at the beginning and the unhealthy ones are at the end. There's a social scientist at Cornell University who has devised the smart cafeteria, and in many places now, cafeterias are being redesigned, not to mandate choice, but to change the choice architecture so that the healthy and low-calorie foods are the most visible. I'm thinking about my wonderful hotel room here in Taiwan, and one thing I really appreciate is the choice architecture in the hotel, where my room is not full of high-calorie chocolate bars. Thank you. If it were, I would have eaten them all. That the choice architecture is healthy. Okay, here's something that our Federal Reserve Board did in 2010. Financial institutions in my country automatically have enrolled people in so-called overdraft protection programs. What that means is if you go over your checking account, they will automatically give you the money, but you're going to have to pay some interest. It's automatic. You're automatically enrolled. That might sound good. The problem is if you overdraw your checking account, you are taking out a very high interest loan. In some cases, a 7,000% interest rate. Very high interest rate. What our Federal Reserve Board said was that we're going to change the default rule so that people can't be automatically enrolled in overdraft protection program. They have to sign up. And the result has been substantially to decrease participation in these programs, which have cost people a lot of money. Very significant results. Our Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a slogan, know before you owe, know before you owe. Now, I don't know if that's a problem here, but all over the world, people are taking out loans and they don't really understand. This is an effort to use a nudge in the form of simple disclosure so that people know. Our Food and Drug Administration is changing the covers of food packages so that people can see the invisible elephant. The basic idea is that when you're buying food, certain health effects associated with the food, say it's very high in sugar or very high in salt, you'll see that. It's a nudge. The hope is that the information will promote health. There's something called an open government partnership whose purpose is to make governments more transparent and accountable by having action plans to increase the visibility into things that affect people's lives. Now, any nation can have a national action plan for openness. In the United States, we found that we've improved our own practices through our national action plan, which has done such things as giving people information about air quality, about water quality, about lines at airports, about crime. Sunlight can be a disinfectant, and that's the basic idea behind open government partnership. Okay, if there's any slide that you remember, I hope it's this one. This is the most important of the group. In Denmark, automatic enrollment in savings has had a much bigger effect than significant tax incentives. Now, as a longtime University of Chicago person, I can't believe I just told you that. It shouldn't be true. A tax incentive should have a very big effect, and automatic enrollment should have zero effect. Nonetheless, automatic enrollment has had a much bigger effect than significant tax incentives. Whether or not savings is an area that's worth investigation here, in any area where behavior change would be in people's interest, automaticity can be very helpful, much more helpful than incentives. There's a company called O-Power, now doing business in many nations, which sends people a little report every month saying how their energy use compares to that of their neighbors. You get a little piece of paper that says you've used more energy than your neighbors, or you've used less energy than your neighbors. The result of that report, which is a nudge, has been equivalent to an 8 to 20% increase in the price of electricity in promoting energy conservation. One strategy, increase energy prices by 15%. Another, send people this little letter. They have equivalent effects. It's using social norms. Simplifying the form for financial support to go to college, simplifying the form has the same effect in getting people to go to college as a several $1,000s increase in the size of the subsidy. That is to say, simplifying the form has a big effect in increasing college participation. Okay, here are some examples from the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team. A reminder to lower income students telling them that they have to do some things before going to college, tells them that they have to do some things, increase college enrollment by 5.7 percentage points. An email campaign to promote savings by people in our military nearly doubled enrollment in federal savings plans. A little letter to farmers designed to promote awareness of a loan program produced a 22% increase in the proportion of farmers who ultimately obtained loans. Now, what makes that significant? It's not 22% increase in the number who applied for loans. It's the number who obtained loans. Just changing a box on a form requiring vendors to confirm the accuracy of self-reported sales produced over $1.5 million in fees collected by the government in 1 quarter, apparently because the box increased honest reporting. So here's what I'm thinking. Our behavioral sciences team is very new. Australia has adopted one a few weeks ago. If your government adopted a group, it could have 4 or 5 people. It could be some of the people in this room. The chances are very good that in terms of reducing the deficit, improving quality of life, achieving whatever goals the nation has, that little 5-person group could produce very big results in a short time. Okay, is nudging tyrannical? Some people are afraid that it is. Note, though, that some form of nudging is inevitable. You can't avoid it. And that if we focus on the 4 problems I've identified, then human error is just part of our species. And so nudging is likely to be valuable. Okay, what about stronger tools? If we want to do something about the problem of climate change, I think no one believes that nudges are adequate. If you think of the public policy problem that most concerns you today, nudging is probably not going to be a sufficient solution. That's true. But in many areas, freedom of choice is an extremely important safeguard. Government or business may not know best. One size may not be able to fit all. And that suggests that the GPS analogy is the right one. For the government to provide the equivalent of a GPS is more likely to be in people's interests and more likely to recognize their dignity than a more coercive approach, at least much of the time. Nudging shouldn't be manipulative. It should be public and transparent. So a default rule or information about credit card usage, it should be completely clear and simple, nothing hidden. Okay, I'm going to tell you a few things about new directions. If you use the internet, it's clear, probably, that you can get something that's personalized for you. It would be possible for a company or for government to know you like certain things and have certain preferences and are female. You are male and have different preferences and different needs, and the default rule that you get will be different from the default rule that you get. That's coming. More personalization. That can be very helpful if your circumstances really are different. It has more accuracy, but of course there's a question of privacy. One often very effective nudge is just to ask people what they want, to make them choosers. What do you want? And that can be like the little fly painted at the urinal, because it asks people to focus their attention on something that they might otherwise disregard. It's often a good strategy. We need a lot more thinking about personalized defaults and about active choosing. I think I'm going to skip this one and talk about poverty and disadvantage. Okay, all over the world, small or large populations struggle with economic deprivation. Here's some empirical findings. If you ask people who are relatively poor to take an intelligence test, they don't do worse than people who are not poor. About the same. If you ask people who are relatively poor to solve a little arithmetic problem and then to take an intelligence test, and then ask people who aren't poor to solve an arithmetic problem and to take an intelligence test, they do about the same. So the evidence is that poor people aren't less intelligent systematically than people who aren't poor. Of course, there are pockets of poor people. There are some who suffer from mental disabilities. But as a class, no evidence of they're less intelligent. But if you ask wealthy people or people who aren't poor to figure out how they would solve a financial problem, their car breaks down, they have to come up with significant money to fix their car, what would they do? And then ask them to take an intelligence test. They do fine. They can solve the problem, then do fine. But if you ask poor people how they would handle a serious financial problem and then take an intelligence test, their intelligence plummets. That is to say that if you ask poor people to focus on how to handle a financial problem, something happens to their minds. In fact, the effect on their intelligence, as demonstrated by a test, is as severe as the effects of having no sleep the night before. This is a long way of suggesting that one problem poor people face is that they are cognitively overwhelmed. They have too much to worry about. That the state of being poor is the state of having to think all the time, how am I going to deal with my financial situation? And that, it's like a computer that doesn't have processing power because the mind is so focused on other things, which is to suggest that the problem of poverty isn't just a problem of not having enough money, though of course it is that. It's partly a problem of not having enough cognitive bandwidth to deal with a wide range of other things. Now, I think this is a very striking set of findings, which suggests that governments are not thinking adequately about what poverty entails. One thing it entails is less mental equipment, not because of less intelligence, but because of too much to think about to solve a problem. Okay. We know that there are two challenges that it's very hard for human beings to overcome. One is mental illness, and the other is chronic pain. If you lose the use of an arm, you're going to be fine. People do completely fine not using an arm. If you're in a wheelchair, your legs don't work anymore, that's a very bad loss, but you'll get used to it. People in wheelchairs aren't way lower in well-being than people who aren't in wheelchairs. Human beings have tremendous adaptive capacity. But the behavioral science suggests that mental illness and chronic pain, it's extremely difficult to adapt to those, which suggests for countries all over the world, those are very serious policy priorities. Okay, so what we've learned is to identify behavioral market failures stemming from absence of attention, from unrealistic optimism, from present bias. We've learned to expand the catalog of policy tools to include choice-preserving approaches, nudges. We know a lot more about how to match the failure to the tool, suggesting we have countless opportunities to improve people's lives. And the hope is, in the not very long run, we can make both lives and cities look more or less like that. Thanks.
Now the floor is open for question. Any question? Please.
Okay, sorry. Thanks. I think you've really persuaded us that nudges can be really used in a very good direction. It can be used to promote a lot of good. I do want to hear a bit more about transparency and publicity, because it seems that nudges can also be used in a very bad way. For example, like promoting. We can ask, if you don't want your government to read your email, please click the box. Or you might be a member of a very small minority that expresses political dissent. And that seems to worry me a bit. And the further, more general question is, how can we kind of avoid domination or like arbitrary interference of these nudging units?
That's great and very important. I think the first thing I'd say is that if you're worried about oppression by government or about damaging actions by government, nudges should be last on your list of concerns. They should be on the list, but they should be last on the list of concerns. First on the list would be criminal punishment. Penalties of any kind would be second on the list. So if you have some sort of mandate or just exercise of government power that overrides choice, that's the really serious threat to liberty. A nudge in the form of information, let's say, that's unwelcome or unhelpful, or even a default rule that is illicit. You know, you're assumed to vote for the incumbent party. So if you don't show up at the polls, you will be credited as voting for that person. That's really bad. That's a very bad nudge. But it's better than saying if you don't vote for the incumbent, you're going to go to jail. It's much better than that. The question of what are the ethical limits on nudges, you're quite right that transparency is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. So you could have a transparent nudge which says everyone is going to be assumed to be of a particular religion unless you tell a public official that you're of a different religion. That could be completely public, but it has an illegitimate end. So there may be constitutional or other limits on whatever government can do. Let's hope so. And those limits would apply to nudging as well as anything else. If the government said that it's presumed that you will be playing tennis every afternoon unless you opt out of the tennis program, that would be too invasive, wouldn't it? Even though at least two of us quite like tennis. So illicit motives would be illegitimate for nudges as for anything else. Those would be the two lines of defense. For government, if there's a democracy, there's a built-in safeguard against the problems that concern you, that is, and that rightly concern you, illegitimate nudging. So if you look at the catalog of nudges done by nations that have been nudging with the influence of behavioral science, it's hard to find any that's ethically controversial. And one reason is that democracy would cry out if there was one that crossed a line. So the things that we're observing are much more like, I'll get them out, much more like what you're now seeing than like the examples you give.
So, Young Chen from Academia Sinica. So I started as a conventional law and econ scholar, and I doing empirical wrong anchoring effect, and mostly because you have convinced me. So here's the question. So from a traditional law and econ perspective, people around the world are like equally rational. If you know that the law of demand holds in Taiwan, you know that it holds everywhere. But for behavioral law and econ literature, I wonder whether you would say people in different culture, different countries, different ethnic groups will be biased or use different heuristics under different conditions. Because in two of your recent books, at least, you cited Taiwan, experiment conducted in Taiwan, and compare that to experiment done in the US. You seem to use that to strengthen your argument. But what is, in addition to promoting Taiwan, what is the motivation of using experiments in other countries to say that's the global phenomenon?
It's a great question. So it would be very interesting to know, with respect to every bias or heuristic, whether there is cross-cultural variation. Loss aversion seems to be hardwired into the human brain, such that monkeys show it also, and there's a neurological foundation. So we wouldn't expect any group, the human group, to be showing something other than loss aversion. I'll tell you the one category of people demographically, and I bet this is true cross-culturally, who don't show loss aversion, men who are in a very romantic mood do not show loss aversion. Women in a romantic mood show loss aversion. But that's the one, men who have a certain kind of enthusiasm, they're not loss averse anymore. But it is a general phenomenon of the human species. Optimistic bias has been tested in multiple places, and there's no society in which it hasn't been found. And there's evolutionary reason to think that there would be a tendency toward optimistic bias. If you are optimistic about your prospects, that might be motivating. If you think, oh, I'm probably going to die, then you're probably going to die. If you think it's going to be better, I can fix it, that's helpful. So the fact that it doesn't seem to be absent yet is supportive of the universality. With respect to prospect theory, I didn't mention that, but you know the stuff. So think of prospect theory as a shorthand for how people deal with risks and how they depart from expected value predictions. I'm not aware of any cross-cultural study that showed a departure from prospect theory. It seems to be general. So the question is, which of these wouldn't be found? And that we have to figure them all out to know the answer to that. The availability heuristic which says people assess probabilities by which thinking what comes to mind, I think you'd have to find a species of robots to find someone who would not be vulnerable to the availability heuristic, though what's available would be cross-culturally variant. Now, in terms of the Taiwan studies I know about group decision-making, there is, along one dimension, a difference between Taiwanese and Americans, which is Americans, for certain kinds of decisions, are more risk-inclined. And Taiwanese, at least in the late 1970s, showed more moderation. And that's not that surprising, that you could find cross-cultural differences of that kind. Men have been shown to be more risk-seeking than women. That's a demographic difference. But the commonality is that Taiwanese, just like Americans, groups tend to accentuate the tendencies of individuals. So it's essentially identical. The question you're asking, it is a terrific question, and it would be really exciting to find some cross-cultural differences with respect to the heuristics and biases literature. We can find, with respect to fairness behavior, which I didn't mention, we can find some differences. So people care about fairness. They're willing to sacrifice money to be fair, and they're willing to sacrifice money to punish people who are unfair. That's a departure from at least one version of standard economic thinking, where material self-interest is what people care about. They actually care about fairness too. The cross-cultural studies do find that while everyone cares a little bit about fairness, basically, how much people care about fairness does vary across cultures. So that's one where there's cross-cultural variation.
Hi, guys. Jimmy Xu from Academia Sinica. Thank you for this great talk. And I'm trying to make connections with the talk you gave yesterday, because I think that there is there's a thread that runs through it. Because when you talk about free speech, we have an ideal system of free expression, but people do have some bias that prevents them from, contributing to building a free speech system like that. And also, nudge is for how you overcome those built-in bias from people pursuing their own goods. But it seems to me that there is a great difference in these two type of issues, because for nudging, I think the GPS analogy is very apt, because basically the government and the individuals have the same destination. It's just that the government is helping you to get to your destination easier. But on the other hand, when you talk about free speech, usually, for example, when the government wants to get you to see things that you don't like, to hear opinions on the other side of the aisle, then it does not make me feel comfortable, or it might even contradict my belief. So there's a greater opposite force that is pulling me from going where I should be going. So I'm just wondering whether the nudging can be applied to free speech issues, or to speak more generally, to create public goods that might not be in the immediate individual interest.
Okay, so that's a great question. So if everyone didn't get that, I'll try to unpack it a little bit. It's terrific. So nudges, in their simplest form, are designed to help people to achieve their own ends. So you have someone who is concerned about the health of their children, and they don't know what they should be buying at the store, and then you see this food pyramid and it's terrible. It doesn't help you. And then you see this and that helps you. Or you might think that you are using a government website to try to figure out what kind of program is best for you in a context where you have some options, and you want a nudge that steers you in a direction that fits your situation. So that's, I think, relatively uncontroversial. The risks arise when the government's interests depart from the interests of the citizens, and they try to nudge people in the direction that they like, not in the... Okay, then we talked a little bit about how to get safeguards against that. There are other nudges that are designed not necessarily to protect choosers, but to protect third parties. And there, the double-sided printing default. Do you have a double-sided printing default here? Yes, great. Harvard doesn't. I'm sad about that. It's a great default. And that's not mostly to protect the people who are printing. It conserves money and it's good for the environment. And automatic enrollment of the sort that I believe in the next 5 years in green energy is going to get a great deal of attention. That is not mostly to protect choosers. It might cost them a little money. It's to protect third parties. So the analysis of that second kind, the third-party nudge, isn't as simple as the GPS. I think it has to be a welfare analysis that talks in terms of costs and benefits. That's the way to do it. So those are two kind of categories. Then there's the free speech category, where let's suppose there's a problem, which is that you have a polarized society in which people aren't giving respectful attention to what others think. And to think of nudges that would help that, that's hard, because the nudges that would maybe promote your attention to competing views, that's not like a GPS, that's like a slap in the face. And who wants that?
Hello, Professor Sunstein. You mentioned that there are some behavioral teams developing in Europe. For example, a new team in Germany. And I'm wondering that how do behavioral law economics and libertarian paternalism be applied in institutional design in Europe? Thank you.
Okay, well, the United Kingdom has had the most experience, so I'll talk about that. If there are a number of people who are unemployed, who can work but don't have jobs, what can you do institutionally to help them? And there are ways of interacting with them that will be unproductive or counterproductive, and there are ways of interacting that are helpful. And what the United Kingdom has done is to try to test what actually helps. With respect to tax compliance, I mentioned an effort to see what kind of letter helps. If you want people to sign up to be organ donors, what kind of communication is the best that will get people to do that? And they test. So the United Kingdom, whether it's concerned with obesity or energy conservation or tax compliance, is thinking what kinds of communications have a better impact. And the United States is doing exactly the same thing. In Germany and Australia, it's a little too early to say, but those would be the kinds of things. These are a little small, I think. Whether it deserves the word institutional is even a legitimate question, so I'm not sure what you mean by institutional. If we're thinking about large things, my own knowledge comes from the United States, our health reform law has a lot of nudges in it. We want to make sure that our prices are down and our consumers are choosing well. And to do that, you know, if you're, let's say, 25 years old, the plan shouldn't be the same necessarily as if you're 75 years old. So you want a plan that suits your situation. We know that consumers have not been making good choices. It's kind of complicated. How can they be nudged? So that involves setting up an institutional practice that's helpful for people. If institutional reform in the large, let's say, how do you have judicial reform, or how do you reform a legislature? That probably involves something that is not like a GPS. It's a different kind of thing.
Hello, Professor Sunstein. And with so much attention already be put into behavioral study, and the government has also noticed about that, is there some legal study about what fields the government should stay away from? For example, should a state set their default education, something like creationism, or a government nations that their education about history?
I'm actually in the midst now, I'd love to do it here, but of a cross-national empirical study of people's judgments about exactly the question you ask. So I have data now from the United States, France, Germany, Denmark, Hungary, the United Kingdom, and Italy, answering exactly that question. And I'll tell you something that quite surprises me, is that on such questions as the one you ask, which nudges are in a legitimate terrain, which are in an illegitimate terrain, there's a lot of consensus, at least across these nations, which have a high degree of diversity. And it'd be very interesting to see if we get the same thing here. I bet we would. So if you ask people, do you favor a public education campaign that can combat childhood obesity? Strong majorities are in favor of that. To my surprise, in either all or almost all nations, majorities at least favor automatic enrollment in green energy. If you ask people, do you favor subliminal advertising in movie theaters to combat smoking and obesity? So you can't see the ad, it's going through your eye very quickly, so you can't consciously see it, but it will register. Do you want subliminal advertising? People say, no, I don't want that. That's illegitimate. You're not treating people with respect. Do you want an advertising campaign that encourages mothers to stay out of the workforce and to stay home with their children? No, people don't want that. Majority say that's not good. I think on the same theory as the creationism default. So most people would object to the creationism default, not everyone, on the ground that that's choosing a very controversial religious theory which has doubtful scientific foundations and defaulting people into it. Now, I have done some tests that are on creationism and evolution, and in the United States, as you expect, you get some disagreement across demographic groups. I think the thing to say about where the nudge would be no good is the same thing as would be said about a fine or a subsidy or a criminal penalty. That is it offending some norm? So if you said that mothers of young children can work, but they have to pay a fine that men don't have to pay, that wouldn't be acceptable, for the same reason that a nudge to encourage women to stay home wouldn't be acceptable. So if we have a principle of, let's say, equality across racial and religious and gender grounds, that would cut through the analysis of when a nudge would be unacceptable. And if we had a principle in favor of educational campaigns that treat people as respectful agents rather than as an object of government's manipulation, then we would also have some something like a knife that would distinguish the legitimate and the illegitimate.
Hello, I'm Hendrik Omeswinkel from National Taiwan University. And my question is, so I have the feeling that when I'm doing interactions in the marketplace, I'm being nudged way more often by companies than I'm being nudged by the government. And most often these nudges are not well-meant nudges, but are trying to get some money from me, such as default options in online forms when ordering stuff. I'm trying to be nudged to buy even more. So shouldn't we, if we now pay attention to implementing nudges from the government side, shouldn't we pay equal attention to preventing bad nudges in the marketplace, so to speak, anti-nudging units?
Well, it would be anti-bad nudges. So now you're going to hear my University of Chicago history in my first response. The first response is, if the market is working well and we have free competition, there is a measure of protection already against bad nudges. So if your cell phone had default settings on it, which said you're going to send a certain amount of money to the company just as a gift to the company every year, people wouldn't like that company very much. Or if your cell phone company said that 10% of the money you pay us will go to the political party we like, you wouldn't like that very much, and the market wouldn't allow it. So if we have a robust form of competition, that is the first line of defense against harmful nudges. But I take your point that in some circumstances, free markets won't solve the problem, and they might make it worse. So the reason they might make it worse is if companies that exploit invisible gorillas prosper, and companies that don't exploit invisible gorillas fail, then the market is going to have a lot of invisible gorillas. And that's probably true. So there's a new book, I think it's in the English language, it might be the most important social science book of 2015. It's very recent. I recommend it to everyone. It's written by two Nobel Prize winners. One is George Akerlof, and the other is Robert Shiller. Akerlof is Akerloff, and Shiller is Shiller. And the book is called Fishing for Fools, where fishing is spelled P-H-I-N-G, and P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G, and fools is spelled P-H-O-O-L-S, Fishing for Fools. And the idea is exactly what you say, that in free markets, companies exploit behavioral biases, and that's a serious problem. So their basic analysis is analytic and empirical rather than what should be done, but it's clear that they think exactly what you suggest, which is that there should be regulatory protection against self-interested fishing, which markets don't sufficiently counteract. I'll give you one example, which may be exactly what you have in mind, which is in some countries a genuine problem, which is if you sign up for some product or good or service, you're automatically enrolled in something else where you're paying a certain amount of money every month. And while it wasn't exactly, it's not exactly a lie, you didn't quite see that you were signing up for that. It wasn't clear. And that is very close to manipulation.
Do you agree? We take two more questions.
Sure.
Two more questions from non-male participants. I want to nudge a little bit. Please.
In one of your slides, you mentioned certain kind of policy could be consideration for the nudge for the future. And you particularly indicated an income tax credit. So do you think an income tax credit already is a nudge, or it can be best modified for certain kind of nudge?
Okay, that's great. So you have a very sharp eye. So you point to something that I didn't mention, and not only that, but you got the acronym. So EITC is Earned Income Tax Credit. I don't know if you have analogs here. The idea is if you are working and not making much money, the government will give you some extra money as a tax credit. It's a great program. So it's one of the most successful programs. It not only gives people more money, it also helps their health and their children's health. So it's one of the best programs we have. It is not itself a nudge. It's an incentive. So to say that if you're poor and working, you'll get more money, that is a standard economic tool. So neoclassical economics, standard economics, University of Chicago, that's the direction. But here's the problem. The percentage of people who are eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, who take advantage of the Earned Income Tax Credit, is not 100. So there are numerous people who could benefit in terms of things that are essential to their having good lives who don't sign up for the credit. that's a very serious problem. So the nudge would be something that makes it easier for them to sign up for the credit, either by simplifying the form or by defaulting, they get it automatically maybe, or by giving them a reminder, something that could, and this is not an unimportant issue by any means. We may be talking about saving lives here through helping people at the low end. So the program is not a nudge, but nudges can make the program work better.
Okay, please.
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. And I have a quick question on default rules, because you mentioned that default rule fits people's preference better because most people stay. I just wonder, could such rule actually also relates to people's consideration of transaction costs? For example, registering costs time and money. So I just wonder whether default rules actually under a mixed influence of both rational decision and also behavioral preference rather than only preference. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. And some default rules are especially sticky because of the transaction costs of changing them. So if you said that you could change your printer to single-sided printing if you ran a marathon, or if you sang a very long song very loud, then you could change it. These are absurd examples, admittedly, but that would increase the transaction costs of changing the default, and the default would be stickier. So defaults can be made to be stickier by increasing the transaction costs of departing from them. The only thing, so in most cases, you're probably right that there is a transaction cost as well as let's say, a pure default effect. And the only thing that the behavioral science, I think, adds is even if transaction costs are zero, default rules will be sticky. So you can make them, really, really small, and still there's an automatic effect from the default. We could do it here with lottery tickets. Do you have a lottery? Do people play the lottery here? If you all got a lottery ticket and you didn't get a lottery ticket, you all are going to demand more to give up the lottery ticket than you are going to be willing to pay to get the lottery ticket, and it's instantaneous, and even if the transaction cost is zero.
Professor Sunstein, I do have one question, maybe two questions. I want to turn the clock back to 1968 in the University of Chicago. When I went there, I did notice University of Chicago spent tremendous effort to recruit excellent Afro-American students to University of Chicago. So 10% of the entrance class are Afro-American. But 4 years later, when those students are graduating, only 1% went through. 90% is stamped failure and was kicked out. So I was arguing with the university, we were doing something terribly wrong by correcting the best student and one by one stamp failure, and send them out. But university took the stand that we gave the opportunities to come to study, and even if fail, they'll go to other college and will do well. And after so many years, after 47 years, I still do not feel comfortable about what university did. So my question is, where should I apply the nudge? To the university, the student, to rectify the horrible situation?
It's a very interesting example. So I'm pondering how to think about it exactly. At first glance, you're clearly right that what we should care about is human welfare. And if 1% of students are graduating and the others are failing, on human welfare grounds, this is not good. If it's the case empirically that the people who flunk out end up going to some other college and doing fine, then it might be okay. So it's kind of an empirical question. The question of how to support people who enter into college to finish college, if they are in a demographic group, let's suppose, of people who sometimes don't finish college, there's a lot of empirical work on that, and it does involve nudges. So things like email texts that tell people what to do and when to do it, things that give people guidance about what courses would be well suited to them at the beginning rather than too challenging. I didn't mention at the bottom of the slide that's now up, it says the 160 character solution by Benjamin Castleman. He is very focused on educative nudges and how to keep people in college. Now, it may be in 1968, in your example, that population, there's just nothing you can do. They're not up to the school. In which case, there's a deeper problem. But for many people who struggle in various domains, there are ways of communicating with them to get them on top of their situation early that have been found to have tremendous results.
Well, thank you. My final question is about global warming, as you discussed a little bit. I think as a scientist, when I look at the program, I always felt that the population consumption issue is now overloading the capacity of Earth. And so I do believe that the science and technology alone, or a single country alone, will not solve the problem. And you always mentioned about changing the behavior, and that is really important. I believe it will be the important thing. But I do think it's a global problem. And somehow we only know that we belong to a certain country, and the citizens of United States or Republic of China or citizens of Japan or Korea, we know very well global problem should be solved by global community. So we do learn to become the citizens of Mother Nature. So from citizens of your country to become the citizens of Mother Nature, that is a big gap. And so I want to learn how can nudge people to become the citizens of Mother Nature.
Okay, that's great. There's an American philosopher named John Rawls who wrote a footnote in a book which he never published the footnote. And the footnote says, we post a signpost, no deep thinking here, things are bad enough already. That's from a philosopher. So if we try to get humanity to think that they are citizens of Mother Nature, I think that's too difficult. I don't even know what it means. So if you try to get the citizens of Canada, and I'm just choosing Canada randomly, it's a very nice country. I like Canada. If you try to get the citizens of Canada to say, we're not citizens of Canada, we're citizens of Mother Nature, I think they would say, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't think I like it very much. So for global warming, I'd go in a somewhat different direction, which is to say, absolutely, it's a global problem. The global problem is one that is threatening people today, and the threat is only going to increase over time. People care that their own lives go well, and they care that their children and grandchildren's lives go well. So what's necessary is some sort of global agreement. I think that is tied to what people already care about, which is themselves and their children. And we've seen significant steps in many nations, not nearly enough, and it's to be hoped we'll see much more in the near future, motivated by the thought that they don't want to see sea levels rising, islands disappearing, their own children's prospect endangered. But we have a better analogy, actually, than what we've seen in recent years for climate change, and that's the problem of depletion of the ozone layer, where that was a very serious problem, and it was solved through the Montreal Protocol. So the ozone layer was at very serious risk, And the nations of the world did work globally to not just to reduce the risk, it's essentially been eliminated, the ozone depletion problem. And I think it didn't get eliminated by people saying, I'm a citizen of Mother Nature. It got fixed because people thought, we don't want to have cancer.
No. Ozone layer, we can find alternative for chlorofluorocarbon, so scientifically solve the problem. That's fine. But I do want to mention, since you like Star Wars so much,
Yeah.
so when we sit together and said, from a galaxy far, far away, and then there comes the enemy to attack Earth, then we knew that we have to work together. Maybe not the citizens of Mother Nature, maybe we are planetarian working together with the planet. So I do want everybody to see Star Wars again,
Yes,
but imagine the other enemies coming to conquer us.
On the priority of the climate change problem, you know, when I was in the U.S. government, this is something I worked a lot on, and I know President Obama, it's an extremely high priority to make sure something happens in Paris. And the signs, the latest signs are pretty good. We're probably going to get something significant. We'll see.
Well, thank you very much for a very insightful lecture, and we learned a lot. Let us give him a great hand. So I appreciate it.